So during the talk, please do shout out with questions. This is going to be a two-way debate, at least for a bit of it. So I've come up to Glasgow, thank you Envika for hosting us, to talk about 100% code coverage. So why am I doing this talk? Well, did any of you make PHP Yorkshire this year? Nope. Did any of you follow it on Twitter? Oh wow, an audience that isn't corrupted by the debate that's already happened. Right, so it started with a tweet. Rob Allen was in the audience when I was speaking at PHP Yorkshire, and he tweeted out a photo of one of my slides. And this is what the slide said. Hopefully you can all read that. I hate reading slides, I'm sorry. But it wasn't a talk about code coverage. It was a talk about building a library, and as part of that talk, I showed how the techniques I was demonstrating would allow you to very easily achieve 100% code coverage. So I took this slide in towards the end of the talk, because I'm looking to encourage people to do 100% code coverage. Now, I don't think that's controversial. I don't think that's factually an accurate statement whatsoever. If you don't have tests for all your code, you're going to be shipping bugs because you've got untested code, and we're going to cover that a lot more. But online, this raised one hell of a storm. Always does. Always does whenever we talk about 100% code coverage. It's a trigger, not a target for people. You tweet about this tonight and see what people respond. Even today on Twitter, I was getting people saying that they don't believe in 100% code coverage. When I mentioned that I was coming here to do this talk, so people still don't believe in it. And that makes me sad. It really does. Yeah, it really gets me down. And the reason it gets me down is because I don't understand the objections to doing 100% code coverage. I don't get it at all. I really don't. So, can you help me out? First of all, how many of you practice and have a target of 100% code coverage in your testing? There are 2 hands in the audience. That's it. Okay. Does anyone have any lower targets? 60, 70%? And a couple more hands. Does anyone have any targets at all? Okay. So the rest of you, are you even collecting code coverage metrics? And if not, why not? What's stopping you? Anybody? Please.
It's going to be very low, very high now.
It's good, right. And why is that?
It's even testing is a new idea.
So testing's a new idea. Okay. Anybody else? What's stopping you doing 100% code coverage? Why aren't you targeting this? Time. Okay. I have some slides on that, on time. Anybody else? Is anyone working for a company where the management actively stop you doing these activities? That you're willing to admit to? Some hands went up there. Of course, you can't hear that on the video. So I don't get it. Why aren't you doing this? It's enforcing it, okay.
This is our target.
Right.
You have to get everybody to agree.
Okay. Why do you have to everyone to agree with it? If I go into a hospital and I have an operation, the doctors and nurses don't need to agree that they've got to take all the instruments out of my body before they stitch me back up. They don't have to agree to that. It's just something they have to do. They can't leave something behind. It's something that, other professions, they have standards they have to hit. Why don't we? I told you I was going to do a bit of a rant.
I think we could go on to explain your idea of what
Yeah, I am.
100% code coverage
I am.
covers.
Yep.
And any other figure, 70% is just kind of arbitrary.
But I'm interested to know why nobody's doing it, first of all, because I don't get it. I mean, my generation joined the industry before the web existed, before the web was commercialized, to be more accurate. And these are practices we just did. It's what we were trained to do, and it was accepted practice. And so for my generation, the standards of software engineering have slid backwards big time, and we don't understand it. Because we're old enough to remember the software crisis of the 70s, the software quality crisis of the 70s. How many of you have heard of the mythical Man Month book? Quite a few hands then, but I'd say about half. So that was a book in inspired by as a response to how bad software was when we had no decent practices at all. And then other generations have come along and it feels like we're reinventing the wheel. So what I want to cover in this talk, I think it'd be a good idea if I explain what I think code coverage is, so we're all on the same page with that. I want to look at what we can learn from code coverage. What does it tell us? What's it useful for? It can't tell us everything. It has its limitations, so let's cover that as well. And let's look about what we can do to deal with the fact it's got limitations. And then let's go into why code coverage matters. Now normally at this part of the talk I'd explain my background, my experience, and then I'm coming here to show you things I've learned, lessons I've learned, often the hard way, but I'm sharing with everybody else to hopefully help you out so you don't make the mistakes I used to make when I was younger. Not today. This is a slightly different talk from me to what you would normally expect from me. I'm here to pick a fight with anybody who doesn't believe 100% code coverage is what you should do without thinking about it. Okay? You're all up for that? You're all looking a bit, I'm not quite sure what the word is. All right then. What is code coverage? What do you think code coverage is? What does it mean to you? Anybody?
Exercising methods.
Exercising methods, okay. Anybody else? Okay. This is what code coverage looks like. PHPUnit will generate code coverage reports for you. And it does them in HTML and it does them in machine readable formats as well for you to plug into other tools. Sonar, I think it's called, is a very popular tool people use with that. Jenkins has plugins for this as well, those of you who use Jenkins. And those of you who don't use any build tools, please reconsider. Okay? But it gives you this is a set of folders and it shows you how your code's doing, how your testing looks. And this particular example, everything's at 100%. And you can drill down into this. You can drill down to the individual method and you can see which tests cover which lines of code. Very handy, and that's a property we're going to come back to. So all that code coverage is, it's a measure. It's actually a metric, not a measurement. But what it measures is the lines of code in whatever you're testing that were executed when you ran your tests. So if you don't run your tests, no coverage. If your tests don't do anything interesting, no coverage. So all it does, it just gives you a number. And that number goes up to 100 in PHPUnit. That's all it is. There's nothing magical about it. It doesn't have any other properties. It simply gives you a list of the lines of code that were executed. But we can do so much with that. So if we take this statement again, lines of code. That's the first thing it does. When you run your code, you can see what you're testing. If we go back a moment to this slide here, I can go into this report and I can see exactly which tests I've tested this code. I can see that. I don't have to guess. And on a large project, that can save a lot of time and a lot of trouble when you're picking up, especially if you're picking up a project off someone else. I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. But it allows us to see on a test-by-test basis what that test actually proves. I'm sure you've all written unit tests and then come back to them at a later date and scratched your head a bit and went, how did this ever work? Why did it ever work? I've done that. Anybody else? A few knowing smiles. Tests they're a fire and forget mechanism. We write them once and hope we never have to look at them ever again. Because if we do, it's normally because something's gone pear-shaped, and we'd rather not have that. But with code coverage, you can see exactly what a test is proving, because you can see what the test is touching. And PHPUnit, I don't know how many of you know, it has the ability to run just one test and generate a report. You don't have to run all your tests. So if you're investigating something, and especially if you're picking up someone else's code, you can start by isolating the test you're interested in, run it, and see from the code coverage report where it's gone. It's a very handy way to take code apart. But it only works if you use code coverage annotations. Those of you who do PHP unit testing. Do you all know what code coverage annotations are? Yep. Okay. For everybody else, and this is where the light is against me, but the slides are up online. Right up here, hidden in the corner, there's a little annotation that tells PHPUnit which method of my code this test is meant to test. So when you run PHPUnit, it throws away the metrics for any other code that is executed by this test. And that's very handy, because it means I can see exactly what tests are touching what code and what code has no tests at all. And that's the other thing about the lines of code that were executed. If we can see what our tests have executed, we can also see the code that hasn't been executed. We can see the code that's untested. Now, untested code is really what all this is about. And here's an example. So I'm working on the next release of a library of mine, and it's quite a big release. And as a result, my nice 100% code coverage has gone out the window for the moment as I'm busy building up the next version of the library. I don't do test-driven development. Nothing wrong with it for those who do. It's not a process that works for me personally. But again, I can drill down. I can see on a file-by-file basis what's done, what isn't. I can go into that code, and I can see where it used to have 100% code coverage and now no longer does. Because I've been into this particular method for this release and I've added some extra bug fixes and some improvements, but there's no test for them yet. Now, the thing is about all this unexecuted code. Untested code may have never been executed. You can't rely on the fact that because you're running the app yourself, that code's getting tested. I've got an app at the minute that doesn't have a test suite. We haven't stabilized it enough to invest in the test suite for it. So what we're doing is we're using a lot of end user inputs instead to exercise the code to give us reasonable coverage for now. And we're throwing in 2.5 million inputs into this code. It does not achieve 100% test coverage by any mean. We've got a lot of work to do to get into all the corners when the time comes. That's 2.5 million inputs, and it still doesn't cover all the code. How many of you are doing like user-based inputs for testing? Anybody? One hand? Do you have 2.5 million inputs? You have 2. So my point there is, if I've got 2.5 million records and it's not exercising all my code, if you've got a lot less records, the chances of it exercising the code isn't very good. And that's not a criticism, it's an observation. The numbers just don't work. But code coverage isn't just for the person writing the code. I'm not doing this, when I'm doing this code coverage and I'm learning all these things, I'm not doing it just for me. I've got code out there from the mid-90s that's still in use today on people's computers. I've maintained code that was written in 1973, the year of my birth, which makes it 40-odd years old. Code outlives developers. Developers come and go, and code tends to be the constant. And you don't want the next maintainer to start from this position of faith. You want to give them evidence, hard evidence, something they can get their teeth into. And I know that goes against the current times. Recent years, science and engineering are not the done thing. We don't have to pander to those forces of ignorance. We really don't. We can be informed. Or, as I've been teaching people for the best part of 20 years now, Guesswork's for amateurs. I get hired to go in and turn projects around. That's what people hire me for. And normally when I go in and I'm taking something apart, it's not just the code, I'm also looking at the organization. Because at the end of the day, code doesn't get into a mess, people get the code into a mess. And that's normally, if you're going to fix something, you've got to fix that side of things. And normally what I find out is a lot of guesswork is going on in an organization that's in trouble. They're not gathering data, they're not looking at metrics, they're not measuring anything. They're going, oh, I think that's okay, I think that's okay, I think that's okay. And then they hit a wall and they realize, no, it's not. but they don't know why. Guesswork, avoid it. Please do avoid it. But there's things it can't tell us. And one of these things is quite serious. There's a limitation in PHP's tools at the moment. It can't tell you all the different ways you can get to that line of code. It can't tell you that all those ways have been tested. It doesn't do what they call branch testing. Tools in other languages do. In PHP at the minute, we do not have those tools, not a complete tool set. So this is what I'm talking about. You got your main code here, and then you may have to branch off with an if statement. It may go one way or the other. That's code branches. And our current code coverage tools can't tell us that we've executed all the different ways you can get to one of those branches. It can only tell you that we've executed all the code in those branches, which isn't the same thing. So that's a bit of a problem, because you can get 100% code coverage, and you can still have your code fail in production. Hence my original slide about if you're shipping code with 100% code coverage, you may still be shipping bugs. It doesn't guarantee you're bug-free. It can't. But the other reason it can't guarantee that, it doesn't prove we're testing the right thing. It doesn't prove your tests are worth a damn. Yeah? I've written garbage tests. I've seen people write garbage tests. It's easy to do. And at the minute, a machine can't solve this problem for you. It can't do it. So code coverage, where's my drink gone? So code coverage proves that code executes, and it proves that your code has a test of some description, but it doesn't prove all the ways through the code work, and it doesn't prove that your tests are doing the right thing. What do you think so far? Anyone disagree with anything I've said? You're all very quiet. Yes, this is turning into a rant tonight, I am sorry. Are there any counter-arguments? Does anyone so far think none of this is reasonable, or any inaccuracies?
Can I just ask you about one thing?
By all means.
You used the phrase software engineering.
I did.
I've always been employed as a software developer.
Okay.
Is there anything to be said about that?
There are some slides at the end. In fact, the conclusion talks about that, that's for sure. But it doesn't talk about software developers. At the end of the day...
It's just to come across someone whose title as an engineer is pretty rare.
Right. I guess in the circles I move, it isn't rare. But also, I'm a trained computer scientist. I am a qualified software engineer. So I have a degree in software engineering. And I've worked at a university. I volunteer at a university. So I guess the world I'm used to is slightly different there, which is why coming and doing these talks is very handy, because I can get a different perspective. But firms I work at down south, they normally call their people software engineers, not software developers. So let's open that to the rest of the room, though. What are your job titles?
I'm an engineer.
You're an engineer? Another engineer? How many of you are software? You're a developer? How many other developers have we got? So that's at least half the room, I'd say, of titled software developer. A few engineers. What about everybody else? What are your job titles?
Programmer, I think.
Programmer? Okay. Right. So those of you with job titles as engineers, do you think of yourselves as engineers doing an engineering process? You're nodding. Anybody else? You don't know if you qualify. Why not?
I think it's an aspiration.
An aspiration?
For it to be engineering rather than...
Okay. Right.
So the reason I mention it is that often I've been in a situation where I don't know where we're trying to get to.
Okay.
We've only got vague ideas
Right.
about where we're trying to get to.
Okay.
We're working to a client specification,
Yeah.
and they've got vague ideas, and you only ever can be vague
Okay.
because they certainly don't have a technical basis from which to work.
Right. But is your client controlling... I apologise. This is a bit of Bit of a tangent, but hopefully we're all going to get something out of this. Does your client control the ways you deliver, or just the requirements that you have to hit? Just the requirements. So the means of working are owned by the firm you work for. Right. So as a group, you can set your own working practices and standards, as long as they allow you to deliver to what the client has asked for.
Sure.
Right.
But the problem is balancing choices and how you implement.
Yep. Absolutely. And where do you go to find information?
What, on potential solutions?
Yeah.
Well, it's usually within house.
Okay.
We're pooling ideas and
Yep.
options.
Okay. And where does everybody in-house get their inspiration from?
You can say I couldn't speak for others.
That's fair enough.
You normally look for a senior person or someone who sounds convincing.
Someone who sounds convincing. The PHP community has no shortage of people who love to sound convincing. And I'm one of them, I must admit. But there are, yeah, if this isn't your flavour, of course, there are many other flavours for you to try in our community. Now, I mean, that does interest me because I'm mindful that those of you who come to user groups, I've spoken at most of the user groups up and down the UK now. I think there's only 3 that I can think of left that I've still to speak at. And you are such a minority in the industry, that you actually come out here and seek out knowledge. The majority of people are on Stack Overflow, and they're just trying to work out, they're trying Stack Overflow answers until one of them looks like it worked. That's what the majority of people are doing, because they don't know any better. So I'm always interested in seeing where people like yourselves go to get information, because as a not just the PHP community, but engineering as a whole, we need to get that information out there to everybody. And coming to talks helps, but there needs to be other ways as well for everybody. I mean, as PHP Architect magazine, for example, how many of you read PHP Architect? A couple of hands. Have you all heard of PHP Architect? No. A few people, but not everybody. Okay. I mean, they run 2 of the big stateside conferences, for example. They've been going since 2004. They're well established. And a very good roster of writers. I highly recommend them. I think it's quite cheap as well, the subscription these days. I haven't subscribed for years, I must confess. Mostly because I know a lot of the people, but well worth checking out. But for anybody else, anything in here so far that you disagree with, you think is unreasonable? Please.
It's not quite that I disagree. I mean, you seem to be arguing for as much testing as you possibly can do. I mean, for example, you've given PHPUnit the ability to
Yes.
do code coverage. That's just unit testing. That's like outside-in testing as well.
Yep.
I mean, is that something you practice? Is that something you would count towards that 100%? Is it 100% of things that you can possibly do?
Right. So I have a disclaimer here. I'm the author of one of those outside-in testing tools.
Okay.
Nobody uses it, so it don't really matter, but I am the author of one of these, and I've, to the best of my knowledge, the outside-in tools don't actually generate code coverage metrics, to the best of my knowledge, because they're not just testing your code. A good test tool will also be looking inside your database to make sure your code has written the correct records to the database and that sort of thing. So they'll be doing so much more, and people don't tend to run Xdebug to capture the metrics on their test servers. Plus, the performance hit may make some testing unviable. Obviously, Xdebug slows things down enormously in order to collect all the metrics. So I don't count that. I'm just focusing on unit testing for today. Now, I will say I'm a great believer libraries should be 100% unit tested, and controllers for MVC type apps are better off with inside-out testing, as you call it, or outside-in testing, functional testing. I think it's a lot easier to test the application that way. But I advocate moving as much code as possible into libraries in order to get good code coverage. Okay. Anybody else? No? All right then. So I mentioned code coverage. There's things it can't do, things it can't tell us. Now normally when we run into something like this, there's a way to mitigate it. But I don't want to, this talk's not about how to write tests. I've done other talks on that. There's other material from people like Chris Hart-Jess out there. There's lots of material available for people who want to go and look at that. But the reason I mention this is I'm used to most of the arguments when I go into a firm and say, look, you've got to get up to 100% code coverage in order to help sort your problems out. What they're struggling with is bad tests in the first place. Their tests are badly designed, badly written, and so complicated it's collapsing under its own weight. Sometimes they're writing untestable code. That's something else to watch out for. But we can do a lot of mitigation in order to help us hit that target. So, testing paths. If we go back to my original statement, the slide that went up on Twitter, one thing I didn't see, and I was really hoping someone online would have pointed out with this isn't the right target. 100% code coverage isn't actually the right target because of the limitations of the tools. It doesn't tell us about all the different branches. There is a better target to aim for, and it's not 100% code coverage. At the end of the day, what your code's doing is it's implementing behaviours and responsibilities. That's what your code does. How many of you have heard of BDD? Yep. I imagine a lot of you probably use BHAT as a result, or an equivalent tool. Yeah. So that is taking requirements, and hopefully the things that have to happen when the code goes wrong as well, and testing it. And if you take that approach into your unit tests as well, this statement turns into this. If you've got tests covering all the behaviours that your code's meant to do, you're not going to ship that many bugs. Hardly any, if you're doing it right. If you're not testing all the different things your code's meant to do, you are absolutely shipping bugs to production. You're going to ship bugs in any non-trivial code base because you haven't thought of and planned for everything that can go wrong that you need to deal with, because you haven't got a test for it to prove it. You may have written some code that should deal with it, but until that code is exercised, you don't know that it's working. And if you don't keep exercising that code, you don't know that it's continuing to work, because code rots. So when I'm writing tests, how many of you know that PHPUnit can generate this kind of report? Anyone seen this? Test docs, it's called. You can take the names of your test methods and PHPUnit will print them out in text and HTML form like this. Very handy. So these names here are actually the method names for my tests. And this is one of the classes in my library that I'm working on, the one that's where the code coverage has gone down. And it's all about behaviours. All the things it's supposed to do. And a couple of things that it doesn't do anymore. Used to do those, now it doesn't. I've not fixed that code yet. But when you write your own tests, do your method names look anything like this? A couple of nods? How about everybody else? Yeah? I'm used to seeing people write tests that say, yeah, it's just focusing on a getter, so they'll go get whatever it's getting, get balance or something, and set balance. And they'll write tests called can get balance, can set balance, and that's it. They won't actually do this sort of testing. Please.
These are great. You can put them in front of a manager.
Yes.
It's English.
It is. And that comes back to BHAT and its benefits as well, and the BDD approach is it's trying to use an English-like language to explain things to people. Absolutely agree. So this is something to go away, and if you don't do it already, it's something to look at and see if you can adopt it in your own tests. Now, proving we're testing the right things, the other thing that code coverage really can't do. I've already said a computer can't help us with that. Maybe one day. Machine learning's all the hype at the minute. Anyone dabble in machine learning? I don't. But just to put the hype in context, for a current client, I was looking at doing some machine learning for them. So I was looking at buying a server suitable for running machine learning on. And that server was quoted £145,000 to own the machine outright. So when you see people talking about machine learning running on graphics cards on laptops and stuff, those are toys. When you think about how much graphical processing power you're getting in a server at that cost to run proper models, to do proper deep learning. The hype train is far ahead of where AI is today at our sort of scale. One day it will get there. These things always do. But at the minute, it's all about the hype train. But that's tomorrow. What can we do today? What would you do today to make sure your tests are doing the right thing? Anybody? What do you do? Do you do anything? When you write a test, does anyone else look at it? No?
I mean, our tests are part of our like, code reviews and stuff.
Tests are part of code reviews, exactly. That's what I was looking for. Hopefully you're all using Git or something that allows a pull request mechanism. So before code is moved from one branch to another, it goes out to other developers to review and comment on, because multiple pairs of eyes are always better than one. I'm a very good developer. Every time my code is reviewed, someone improves it. Someone always finds something that I've overlooked or done something daft with, or where I've been too ambitious. My code reviews improve everybody's code, and they can improve your tests as well if they're included. I've actually got a talk I did at PHP Cambridge. It wasn't videoed as far as I remember. They may have videoed it. I didn't have the camera at the time. But the slides are online, and it goes through a 3-step code review process, which I would highly recommend, which incorporates testing as part of the code review process. PHP Cambridge, it would have been probably February, March time last year. Highly recommend it. You go check that out. But there's other things we can do as well. So we've talked about testing based on behaviours, not on lines of code. How many of you have heard of Square? ISO 25000. So you were in the audience when I talked about that. Yeah. I don't know if that's cheating or not. I've not thought of that. So I know a lot of people go ISO and quality. They go ISO 9000, ISO 9001. And instantly, eyes glaze over, everybody runs away. If you're a contractor and you're being ISO audited, you normally get kicked off the premises, so you can't tell the inspector things they're not supposed to know, that sort of thing. But ISO have gone a long way from the days of ISO 9000. There's a new set of standards called ISO 25000. They are excellent. I have used these to test a government project, a national level project. It was one of the largest IT projects in the country at the time. And we use this to drive the final quality audit of that entire project, because it tells you what things matter to who and helps you isolate those, so you can then come down with methodologies to test those individual things and produce some hard facts to put in front of a manager, in front of a budget holder, trying to get an invoice signed, for example. You can put it in front of these people and show them that you've got tests that mean something. It's a little dry, the PDF is, but I highly recommend it. It's a whole series of them, and if memory serves, they're still writing some of them. But the key ones for testing purposes are out. Well recommend it. I did a talk on it, which Michael mentioned, out at PHP Northwest. That would have been last year or the year before. Probably a year before now. So that talk would have been videoed and the slides are online. Again, I highly recommend seek that out, go have a look. But if nothing else, even if your tests are garbage, at least they're still running the bloody code. They're doing, even if the test doesn't actually prove the code works, at least they prove the code runs. How many times have you had to ship a new release because code in productions failed with a PHP syntax error? I've done that over the years. Yeah. There's a few nodding heads. I can understand people not wanting to admit it on camera and all the rest of it. In the old days, people used to log on to production servers. Before we had cloud, where everything ran on 1 or 2 boxes, people would log on to production servers to deliver these kind of fixes. And there's a few people smiling knowingly there at that point. I'm glad I'm not the only one who's had to do that. So, even a bad test is better than no test at all. Bad tests have problems. They can give you a false sense of security. They make you think your code's doing great when in fact it's not. But they'll save you at least the embarrassment of your code not even executing in production, which is a start. So just to pull all that together, my arguments are that code coverage proves your code runs. If you're testing behaviours, not testing code, you're proving that your code does anything useful, and you're being prepared for what's going to be thrown at it. Humans are part of the equation. Use your humans to test your tests and make sure everything's all right. And there are standards out there in the outside world, outside the bubble of the PHP community, that you can use if you need guidance on testing, on what kind of tests make a difference. Right. Is this convincing anybody? Anybody at all feel like they might be going back to the office tomorrow or next week and looking at code coverage in a slightly different light? Okay. And yourself, that's great. So that's a couple of hands. Most of you look like you remain unconvinced, or maybe you didn't need to be convinced, I don't know. But, so that's a lot of what. I want to talk about why.